Turkey has launched an operation in Syria's Afrin region. We will be talking with Turkish President Erdogan's senior advisor Gulnur Aybet on Operation Olive Branch and its possible effects on Turkey's foreign relations. I am Gonca Şenay and this is One on One. The long-expected Afrin operation started a few days ago. Could you tell us what Turkey is doing in Syria? What is the main target?
The main target is the terrorist organizations that have used the excuse of the war to open a geographical space for them in areas where they were not deployed before. Unfortunately, these areas are adjacent and close to the Turkish border, so they do constitute a security situation for Turkey. The PYD terrorist group, the YPG, which is their armed branch, is equivalent to the PKK, which is a terrorist organization as recognized also by the United States and the EU. And the PKK have been launching operations in Turkey, in the southern provinces, by using the launch pad of their sister organizations' deployment along the borders. And Afrin is particularly an area which has become increasingly a security concern recently because there have been more attacks on Turkey's southern provinces from that region by the terrorist group, the YPG. But also there are elements of Daesh as well in that area. So Turkey's target is basically to secure its border, to create an environment that's stable for the local population, because they have also been suffering in these areas under the control of the terrorist organization. And to also, another objective is to prevent the establishment of a terror corridor alongside Turkey's very long border with Syria. So these are the objectives of the operation, and the target are these terrorist organizations.
The next stage is expected to be Manbij. Why is Manbij important at this point especially?
Manbij has always been important for us because, as you know, Turkey last year launched the Operation Euphrates Shield, which cleared a very large area from the Daesh terrorists and actually brought stability to that region that hadn't existed before, allowing refugees also and displaced people to return. So Manbij is important because it's right adjacent to that area that Turkey has cleared from Daesh, but also the local population in Manbij are largely Arab, they're not Kurds. So what the YPG is doing by controlling that area is enabling their own people to settle in there, but also they're persecuting the local population there. So we don't want to see any demographic changes occurring across the Syrian map due to terrorist organizations taking advantage of the war and opening up these geographical areas for them. And it's also important for Turkey, the absolute importance of maintaining the territorial integrity of Syria. But also we regard it as a security threat for the YPG terrorist group to deploy themselves in this way, particularly to the area west of the Euphrates. Now, we know that unfortunately, our NATO allies, the Americans, have been arming and helping and training this terrorist organization. And we have told them that we do not wish to see YPG elements west of the Euphrates, and the Americans promised that they would be leaving that area once they had finished fighting off Daesh, and they would retreat back to the east of the Euphrates. This, unfortunately, has not happened. That's why we want to make sure that it does, and that's why Manbij is important at this stage.
Seems like the most important and maybe the only concern that we hear from the foreign community is the civil casualties. What is Turkey doing about that?
The Turkish Armed Forces and also the Free Syrian Army that are working with the Turkish Armed Forces are taking utmost care to avoid collateral damage and to not inflict any harm on civilians. Turkey has an issue not with the local population, which are made up of Kurds as well as Arabs and Turkmens, but only with the terrorist organizations YPG and Daesh. So they're taking utmost care to target specifically the terrorist targets in those regions, including logistics, supplies, and headquarters, and so forth. But Turkey is also undertaking humanitarian assistance to the local population. For example, the Turkish Red Crescent is poised and ready in the area Azaz, which is within the Euphrates Shield area, to provide aid and shelter to civilians fleeing from Afrin. Unfortunately, the PYD has not allowed these people to be evacuated. So that is tantamount to using them as human shields. So we're waiting for some kind of clear passage so that these people can be looked after for the duration of the operation in safe areas and then return to their homes. And that's precisely what the objective is here, to protect the civilian population and allow people to return home.
Why does Turkey consider the YPG threat? What would have happened if YPG remained in northeastern Syria?
Well, the YPG's objectives and their political branch, the PYD, is pretty obvious. I mean, they constitute a serious existential security threat for Turkey because not only are they the affiliate of the PKK, which is a separatist terrorist organization which threatens the territorial integrity of Turkey, but also their sister branch, the Syrian YPG, are intent on creating a long strip across Turkey's border, just adjacent to Turkey's border, under their control. These are areas which have not been under their control before, but they took advantage of the war to establish this.
And this is Turkey's longest border.
It's a 911-kilometer border, and it's pretty obvious what the YPG is trying to do. They're trying to establish a contiguous terror corridor next to Turkey's border. That is a direct existential threat to Turkey's national security. Plus, the PKK have been using the YPG and PYD held areas to launch operations inside Turkey and to use this as a launching pad for their terrorists to infiltrate across the border. We also want to prevent that because, as you know, Turkey has suffered a long series of very large terrorist attacks from this organization in recent years. So, and that's because the terrorist attacks have exacerbated and got worse because they've been exploiting the PYD, YPG presence in Syria. That's why they cannot remain in those areas. For Turkey, it's an utmost national security concern.
We have been discussing US-Turkey relations for some time now, and the most important topic is the YPG. We know that the US is providing arms and training to this organization. Why is it backing a terrorist group?
It's a very good question. We've asked the same question to the American authorities ourselves many times, and we told them repeatedly that you can't fight one terrorist organization by arming and training another terrorist organization, because eventually this is going to backfire. The Americans had an argument that this was an effective fighting force and they wanted to work with the YPG against Daesh. And they made a promise that once the Raqqa operation was over, that they were going to take back the weapons that they'd given to the YPG. We see that this has not really happened so far. We do want to see more transparency with regards to what the Americans are doing in trying to get those weapons back. Well, we also know there's a lot of weapons, about 5,000 truckloads worth of weapons, and not all of them light, a lot of them heavy weapons, that have actually been unaccounted for. So we're hoping we're going to get more transparency on this from the Americans, because this is also a serious national security concern for us, especially when those weapons end up in the hands of the PKK, which then use them against us. So this is why we expect the Americans to give us more transparency on this. And frankly, there was no need for the United States to arm the YPG in the first instance, regardless of the operation in Raqqa, because the Turkey had already presented a plan to them that they could work with the Turkish armed forces and the Free Syrian Army in defeating Daesh. And Turkey has already proved that they can do this with Operation Euphrates Shield. So it's wrong to say that the YPG was the only force on the ground the Americans could work with. And I think, this has been proven in the field to be wrong. So as to why they worked with them is still a mystery, I think, to all of us.
I was going to ask, are they trying to balance their interests in the region and Turkey?
I think, it's very difficult to follow exactly what the American policy on Syria is.
Seems like there's a conflict on this too.
It's not just Turkey. I think a lot of our European allies in NATO are also confused about the American overall strategy in Syria. On one hand, you have a very tactical, militarily focused operation on defeating Daesh in Syria and Iraq, without very little consideration for the consequences of that tactical planning. In other words, no strategic oversight in place, and no consideration for the political aftermath of the war in Syria. So it's been a very sort of narrowly focused, tactical, short-term planning in defeating Daesh and using whatever force you can find that's readily available without much consideration for long-term tactics. On the other hand, they've also literally, the Americans have also literally sort of left over the political process to be driven by the Astana and the Sochi process, because they have refused to take part in this. And as you know, Turkey, Russia, and Iran are the three guarantor states in that process, which so far has been the only deliverable in terms of matching what's the reality on the ground with the reality of a pending political solution, in a way that Geneva has been a lot more. It hasn't really delivered the same kind of result. It hasn't been that clear as a process. But that is not to say, Turkey's always made this very clear, that Astana and Sochi complement Geneva. They're not an alternative to it. If anything is going to be achieved in Geneva, it has to be achieved through Astana. Now, because America has been out of the picture there, they have not really had a hands-on approach to any political solution. So they've only gone in there with these short-term tactical considerations without thinking anything further. And I think this has actually left a vacuum in terms of US leadership in the region. And that is why regional countries like Turkey, who are facing an existential security concern from the situation in the war in Syria, have had to take matters into their own hands.
A US delegation has arrived in Turkey to discuss a number of issues. Do you think relations could improve? Is there a way for that?
Yes, I think so, because the Americans, whoever you speak to, whether it's from the state or the military, the State Department or the military, they want to see relations get back on track. I think they're genuinely concerned about Turkey moving on in Syria by itself, either in this operation as we saw, but also its cooperation with Russia and Iran in the Sochi Astana process. So they do have concerns about these things. What are they willing to do about it? That's the bit that's kind of unclear, because we keep repeating to them over and over again that you have to stop arming the YPG. You have to take the weapons that you gave them back. You have to have transparency as to the number of weapons that have already been delivered, and they need to be taken back. Now, that in that respect, the response has been very slow, and they've actually been, skirting the issue, if you like, in that sense. But on the other hand, they're also very concerned about the rise of anti-Americanism in this country, and that has really happened to a profound degree since the war in Syria, and the American openly and blatantly siding with the YPG in this way has caused a backlash in Turkish public opinion. And we're not just talking about, one segment of the society, but I can say all across Turkish society, there's a increased level of anti-Americanism. So this is something that the Americans are genuinely concerned about. So I think, it's useful for delegations like this to come and visit and talk about these issues, and it could sort of serve as a platform to move things forward. But until the Americans have an overall strategy as to what they want to do in terms of bringing lasting, sustainable peace and stability in the Middle East, I don't think we're going to get very far if they keep focusing on just tactical, short-term solutions.
And still there is this Fethullah Gülen issue.
Yes, there is that as well. And Turkey has given heaps and heaps of evidence with regards to the Gülen movement to the American authorities, and evidence that they have been behind the coup. But the American legal process has been astonishingly slow. We know that it's a separate process, and each legal system has its own intricacies, and this has been explained at length to us. But there is, at this stage, we think that we would definitely like to see some tangible moves on the part of the United States, politically as well as legally, that they are taking this issue seriously. Now, whether this is true or not, they're giving the impression that they are not taking the Gülen issue seriously, and it's up to the Americans to prove to us that they are. And I think we've reached that point now, especially if they want to better relations and overcome the rise of anti-Americanism in this country. They have to do this.
Now that Turkey is in full cooperation with Russia, does that mean Russia's attitude towards the YPG is changing?
Well, since the Americans have been backing the YPG, Russia has been kind of uncomfortable about a US-backed force in the area because they see themselves staying in the region for the medium to long term. So that's why they made their own overtures to this group. But under the Astana and Sochi process, an agreement has been reached between the three guarantor countries that no party can take part in the peace talks if without the consent of the three guarantor countries, and as you know, Turkey is one of them. So Turkey has always said that, and I think the Russians understand this, that the PYD are not representative of all the Kurds in Syria. And in fact, there's a Syrian Kurdish National Council, which is an umbrella organization made up of all the other opposing factions of Kurds who have also suffered under the YPG-controlled areas, because as you know, the YPG doesn't exactly treat people who are opposed to them very nicely, and that includes Kurds as well, not just Arabs and Turkmens. So, we would prefer to see this Kurdish group taking part, representing the Syrian Kurds in any upcoming talks, not the PYD. And it looks like they will take part in the Syrian National Dialogue Congress, which is made up of all the opposition members, including the regime as well, in this Sochi Astana process. And that actually leaves a open way towards Geneva, because Geneva so far has not been very clear in what it can deliver, but the Sochi process has been more successful in sort of meeting the reality on the ground with a viable political solution for a sustainable peace and stability. And of course, for Turkey's priority is to ensure that displaced people and refugees can actually go back to Syria and to create a safe and stable environment for that to happen. So, this has been one of the main priorities for Turkey. And the Sochi process, in that sense, has had a much more realistic outlook to achieving that result and creating a base for Geneva to move forward.
What comes after Sochi for Syria? What will happen next?
What will happen? We're hoping that, a viable, first of all, a viable ceasefire that can hold in all areas. We're hoping that we can clear terrorist elements next to our borders so our national security is taken care of. And that the people of Syria will be able to choose their own governance, and that the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Syria are paramount in this respect. So we're hoping that Sochi, in a realistic way, will open or pave the way for these developments so that a final settlement can be reached in Geneva. And we would like to see medium to long-term sustainable peace, the conditions for sustainable peace to be available on the ground.
And the leaders will continue meeting?
Yes, that's right, yes. So the three guarantor countries are continuing to meet under the Sochi and Astana process to make sure that that happens.
NATO was a topic that was discussed a lot in Turkey besides the US. What was NATO's reaction to the Afrin operation?
Yes, well, NATO has always been, involved in terms of Turkey's security from the very beginning of the Syrian war, such as the deployments of patriots, which Turkey had asked for. And every time throughout this very long war, we had attacks on our borders. We actually convened NATO emergency meetings under Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty, under crisis management. But a direct threat to Turkey's national security from a tangible external force actually comes under Article 5, where all the other member states have to come to the aid of the threatened or attacked country. In this respect, when the United States official, a coalition official, a military official, announced that they were going to form a border security force from the YPG, immediately the first reaction from Turkey, when the president was reacting to this, he said that what is NATO going to do, because this is a direct threat to our security from a known terrorist organization. Now I think, opening the way for NATO and bringing NATO into this row that Turkey has with the United States over this was very significant, because we saw immediately first the NATO Secretary General and then NATO itself making an official statement that Turkey's security is of utmost importance for the alliance, and they understand Turkey's legitimate security concerns with regards to its border and the fight against terrorism. And we can recently see that Turkey's, NATO's European allies are also quite disturbed by the way the United States has handled its relations with Turkey with regards to the YPG. And that's, I think, quite significant.